your children, and would not be comforted because they are not. But when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeareth in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Arise, and take the young child and his mother, and go into the land of Israel, for they are dead which sought the young child's life. And he arose, and took the young child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus did reign in Judea in the room of his father Herod, he was afraid to go thither. Notwithstanding, being warned of God in a dream, he turned aside into the parts of Galilee. And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophets, He shall be called a Nazarene.
Shopping for your pet is easier than ever. No, really. You get same-day delivery of what?
All right, here we go. Gospel of Matthew, Matthew for Beginners, lesson number 2. Title of this lesson, The New Testament Canon. The New Testament Canon. So let's review a little bit of lesson 1, which was about the times and the society that Jesus lived in, very, very briefly here to kind of set the stage, because some of you weren't in this class when we first started. So Jesus was born during the dominant period of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire ruled at the time that Jesus was born. Palestine is under the control of the Romans. Politically, it's ruled by a Roman appointee, who is King Herod. Maintained by the Roman military under Pilate, and led in their day-to-day affairs by the wealthy Sadducee priests and their main teachers, the Pharisees. The country at this time is a hotbed of political and social turmoil, and it is straining at the leash of centuries of foreign domination, and also stirred up by glorious expectations of a kind of a military political Messiah that will free them from slavery and restore them to the golden era. They're thinking the golden era of Solomon, when they were a world power, when things were great, and they're anticipating this. So Jesus comes along. He's born in Bethlehem. He lives in Egypt for a while. He's raised in Nazareth by a poor couple. He grows up like other boys, learning a trade, learning how to read the law, attending synagogue, and on a yearly basis anyways, attending temple worship festivals and so on and so forth. We know that he enters public ministry at the age of 30, confronting the people, confronting the Pharisees, confronting the Sadducees, confronting the king, confronting the Roman leaders, with the claim that he is the Messiah, and he is the hope of Israel. And you have to think now, considering what they were expecting, no wonder they were surprised. No wonder they were surprised. It was like whiplash. He was the last guy they thought was going to be the Messiah, but they couldn't deny the miracles. That was the problem. You know, that was the problem that they had. So he is hailed as king, he's killed as a criminal, and he's resurrected eventually to demonstrate his deity and his lordship. So there's, in a nutshell, you know, Matthew, and some of the things we talked about last week. So Matthew, one of his disciples, writes about his life and teachings and actions, and we have Matthew's account of these things in what is called the Gospel of Matthew. All right, so there's a little nutshell of what we did last time. So I'm going to talk about the New Testament canon today in this lesson, because before we actually talk about Matthew himself and how we got his book, I think we should talk a little bit about how and why the books of the New Testament, why were they put together in the first place? In the early church, the only written scripture used at first was the Jewish writings, or the scriptures now referred to as the Old Testament. Right? The apostles used these to argue the deity of Jesus. These were the proof texts that they used, in addition to their own, in addition to their own teachings, they're also in addition to their witness of the resurrection. But when they wanted to refer to Scripture to prove that Jesus was the Messiah, they were referring to the Old Testament. For example, in Acts chapter 2, verses 14 and 15 and 16, Peter, when he's preaching, begins, he says, "But Peter, taking his stand with the 11, raised his voice." This is on the day of Pentecost. Jesus has risen from the dead. 40 days later, 50 days later, at the Feast of Pentecost, many, many thousands of people are in Jerusalem. Peter gets up, begins to preach. He says, "Men of Judea and all you who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you and give heed to my words. For these men are not drunk as you suppose, for it is only the third hour of the day." And I neglected to mention that the Spirit of God had come over the apostles. They were speaking in tongues, speaking in different languages. The people were amazed. So Peter is saying, these men are not drunk, okay, as you suppose, for it is only the third hour of the day. But this is what was spoken of through the prophet Joel. And then he quotes Joel, and he says, "And it shall be in the last days, God says, that I will pour forth of my Spirit on all mankind, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even on my bondslaves, both men and women, I will in those days pour forth of my Spirit, and they shall prophesy." So what does Peter do to prove that what is happening before these people is actually part of God's plan to bring the Messiah? Well, he says to them in Joel, Old Testament prophet, the prophet said, "When the Messiah comes, you will know the Messiah has come because everyone will have the Spirit." Young people, old people, men, women, the poor, everyone will have the Spirit. So you ask yourself, well, what do you mean everyone will have the Spirit? Well, realize that in the Old Testament, not everybody had the Spirit. I mentioned this in our other class on Sunday. I mean, only a few people had the Spirit, and only for a little amount of time. The prophets had the Spirit. Isaiah said the Spirit came upon me. Okay, and he spoke. And even Saul, the king, for a moment, for a few times, the Spirit came upon him and he prophesied. And Samson, the Spirit came upon him and he did great things. And Samuel. So only certain people had the Spirit just for a time. So the promise of the Old Testament about the Messiah was that when the Messiah comes, everybody will have the Spirit. Everybody will have the Spirit. Not just the kings, not just the prophets, not just the judges. Everybody will have the Spirit. That's what Joel is talking about here. That's what Peter is referring to here when he's talking in Acts chapter 2. These men are not drunk, he says. What you're seeing here is the fulfillment of Joel's prophecy when Joel said, when the Messiah comes, everybody will have the Spirit. And see, here are these 12 men. They've all got the Spirit. They're all talking in tongues and so on and so forth. All right? In 2 Timothy chapter, he continues, he continues to quote Joel, "And I will grant wonders in the sky above and the earth below," and so on and so forth. Anyways, the point I'm trying to make here is the proof text he uses to demonstrate what is going on is of God is back in the Old Testament. Why? Well, that's all they had. They just had, the Old Testament. The New Testament obviously wasn't written. Then in 2 Timothy 3:15, Paul says a little bit later on, he says, "And that from childhood," he's talking to Timothy here, a young evangelist, he says, "And that from childhood you have known the sacred writings which are able to give you the wisdom that leads to salvation through faith which is in Jesus Christ." What sacred writings? Well, the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament. Those were the only sacred writings available to the apostles when they began to preach. So Timothy came to know Christ and salvation how? Well, he knew the Old Testament. Well, how did that help him? The Old Testament pointed him to who the Messiah was going to be, and what to look for, and what would happen when the Messiah came, and so on and so forth. Okay? So with the spread of the gospel through the preaching and the miraculous works of the apostles, their own writings came to be as authoritative as the Old Testament scriptures, especially with churches that were made up of mainly Gentiles. Let's face it, the apostles were teaching, but they were also doing miracles. Would it seem, normal to you that the person who can raise somebody from the dead, or someone that can heal someone miraculously, if they say what I'm saying to you comes from God, you can pretty much, believe that? So, as the apostles, ministered, as they traveled, as they preached, as they performed miracles, their writings came to be accepted as inspired as of God. So the apostles themselves were aware of their responsibility to teach and to preserve for the church the words of Christ and the power that had been given to them in order to accomplish this. So in Matthew chapter 28, for example, the apostles, or Jesus says to the apostles, teaching them to observe all that I command